Shang, Zhou, and the Classics. For 3 millennia, beginning about 5000 BC, the Yang Shao culture flourished in China. By 3500 BC, millet was grown widely in the northern plains of China. Fishing was a main activity, and domesticated pigs, fowl, and later cattle, sheep, and goats were eaten. In the south, rice was developing. Stylized fish and animals decorated some of the burnished pottery. In the 24th century BC, the Shan culture began using a wheel to make thin-walled black pottery. Like the Yangshao, these people lived mostly in pit houses in villages that encircled a central long house, but their towns were larger and more permanent. Graves are supplied with richer objects such as carved jade and pottery. The divinatory practice of scapulimancy began, which studied the cracks that appeared on baked bones as an oracle to predict the future and confer guidance. The first writing was probably the inscriptions made on these bones indicating the question and the answer. The character of the word book was discovered on these bones, indicating not only the existence of shamans, but perhaps scribes as well. Traditional Chinese history gives the dates 1766 BC for the Shia Dynasty, but the writing about it comes from the Zhou Dynasty in the first millennium BC. The word Shia meant summer and was depicted as flourishing trees. Since ecologists have determined that in the Neolithic times, the northern plain of China was covered with forests, which later were obliterated by human destruction, we could infer that Shia times were remembered as a richer environment. The deforestation may have been a factor in the social degeneration that allowed a more warlike Shang culture to replace the Lungshan, whose late use of arrowheads, spears, daggers, and clubs foreshadowed the conflicts that were to worsen with the Shang warriors, who dominated China for 3/4 of a millennium until their overthrow by the Zhou Dynasty in the 11th century BC. Shang Dynasty. According to the history Shang Shu and the Shi Jing, the ancient book of Odes, the Xia were overthrown by Shang King Tong, the Successful. The Shang developed the use of bronze to a fine art, beginning with fish hooks, bells, pins, and projectile points, and developing into an industry to produce these items and axes for the elite who could afford them. The social stratification led to kings and nobles who conscripted common people for military service and public construction projects. Buildings made of pounded earth walls rose as high as 9 meters. These ceremonial centers were surrounded by thousands of pit houses, shops, animal pens, and storage pits. Superstitious kings even went so far as to have their bodies buried with other humans and horses who must have been sacrificed. The traditional dates of the Shang Dynasty are 1766 to 1122 BC, but recent scholarship suggests that this culture lasted nearly 500 years and was overthrown by the Zhou Dynasty about the middle of the 11th century BC. The Shang were centered around the Yellow River and moved their capital many times, though it was near modern Anyang for more than 250 years after it was moved there by the powerful ruler Pan Geng in the 15th century. Primarily agricultural and disliking dairy products, the ancient Chinese did eat pigs, cattle, sheep, chicken, and dogs. This is not quite as bad as it sounds, since their dogs probably did not eat meat. Hunting provided fur coats for the cold winters. Hemp was also cultivated for clothing, which seems to have been well sewn with sleeves. Shang religion was based on the worship of ancestral spirits and the supreme god Shang Di. Major decisions were made in the ancestral temple and were assisted by divination interpreting the cracks made when tortoise shells and bones were baked in fire. The king headed a feudal system in which he could call upon nobles for help in fighting against barbarians and invaders. Shang culture was extremely patriarchal and traditional, since the oldest were closest to the ancestors, though inferior to them. A woman could become a powerful matriarch if she was the oldest survivor of her generation in a powerful family. A king might have more than one wife, but usually did not. Oracle bones reveal one king with 3 wives, 2 with 2 wives, and 26 with only 1 wife. Shang development of bronze technology and artistry, H.G. Creel considered superior to that of the Italian Renaissance. Metal weapons and chariots with horses did give knights an advantage, but the power of their bows was such that the arrows could easily penetrate their leather armor. Thus, aristocrats were not invulnerable in war, enabling common soldiers to overthrow their leaders if things got too bad for them. Archery, as the main skill involved in war and hunting, became the most popular sport in contests, along with charioteering. Cities were walled, and armies numbered in the thousands. In the 13th century BC, King Wu Ding fought several wars over pasture lands, and large water projects had to be protected. They traded so extensively that the name for merchant is based on the term Shang Ren, meaning Shang man, or person. Cowrie shells from the sea were used as money, and royal tombs contained their wealth along with the sacrifices of humans, horses, and dogs. Their writing, which has been found on oracle bones and bronzes, began with pictograms, developed ideograms, and used phonograms. The Chinese language, as well as Chinese culture, developed directly from the Shang. Writing on the oracle bones indicates that the main things they wanted to know about were sacrifices, announcements to the spirits, diplomatic banquets, traveling, hunting and fishing, war, crops, weather, illness, and the coming 10-day week. The character for evil depicts a snake attacking the foot of a person. Clearly, the purpose of the oracles was to avoid danger and calamity by pleasing God and the ancestral spirits. Human sacrifice was practiced by the Shang as indicated by the character for sacrifice, which shows a person's head being chopped off. The numbers sacrificed do not seem to be large, except in the case of the Qiang, who were killed in greater numbers because they appeared to have been sheep herders who interfered with Shang cattle grazing. The practice of human sacrifice naturally decreased in the Zhou era. Nevertheless, it was clear that in Shang society, a king or lord had the power of life or death over those under him. Slavery, usually from those captured in war, was also common. The word for servant indicates the cultural evolution. At first, captives were counted as heads and depicted as an eye. This character then came to mean a slave, a servant, a retainer, and eventually a minister of state. Thus, as writing developed and became more influential, advisors to the king who were literate gained more power. When the Shang were overthrown by the Zhou in the 11th century BC, the Qiang tribe supported the Zhou revolt. Zhou Dynasty. In the 11th century BC, the Zhou house became strong in the west by conquest and alliances with nearby states. Wen Wang, whose mother was a Shang princess, took over much territory to the north and south of the Shang kingdom. When the Shang were weakened by battles with nomads in the north and natives to the east, Wen Wang's son, Wu Wang, crossed the Yellow River and marched his army against the Shang. According to Zhou histories, the time was not right yet, but 2 years later he returned and with the capitulation of the Shang vanguard took over the Shang capital. Tixin, the last Shang king, immolated himself in his favorite pleasure pavilion, but his son was allowed to rule a subject state. Wu Wang also soon died, but his brother, the famous Duke of Zhou, Zhou Gung, completed the conquest for Wu's son while acting as regent. 2 of his brothers, however, joined the Shang prince in a revolt, which was crushed by Zhou Gung after 3 years of fighting all over China. A Zhou capital was constructed along the Yellow River near what is now Luoyang in Honan to control dozens of feudal states in the east, though the main capital remained in the western Wei Valley. The Shang capital was destroyed, but their culture was allowed to survive. The Shang family continued to offer sacrifices to their ancestors until 286 BC in the state of Sung. These feudal states were essentially walled cities that protected, controlled, and exploited their peasant populations. Nobles were allowed to rule over their territories in exchange for tribute and helping in fighting wars. Though they followed the traditional Shang religion, the Zhou developed the concept of heaven, Tian, as a guiding force which supported those who ruled virtuously and abandoned those who did not. The king was known as the son of heaven. Patriarchal families were the basis of power and relationship, politically as well as personally, and whole families were often held responsible for the actions of their individual members. The first 2 centuries of the Zhou dynasty were fairly peaceful within their realms, though wars were often fought with nomads on the perimeters to expand the kingdom. In 1002 BC, the 4th Zhou king, Zhou, did not return from such an expedition to the Yangtze River. A tyrannical king named Li Wang, who ruled from 878 to 841, departed from virtue by hiring a sorcerer to point out those who criticized him so that he could have them killed. The king bragged of how the slandering of him had stopped because the people had become even afraid to talk. But the Duke of Shao pointed out that he had merely dammed it up, which could be as dangerous as preventing the flow of water. 3 years later, King Li was expelled by the nobles, who chose 2 of their own to rule until the crown prince was installed. The use of writing and record-keeping was so extensive in China that after this event in 841 BC, dates are generally considered to be accurate. In 771 BC, King Yu Wang was killed by invading barbarians, and the resulting split between 2 courts led to the acceptance of the eastern capital as primary, marking the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. The practice of concubines was still common, and women were expected to be subservient. Although peasants might choose their own mates, the marriages of the aristocrats were usually arranged by the all-powerful older generation of the family. For 3 months before she was presented to her husband's ancestral spirits, the wife was on trial and could be returned to her family. A man could divorce his wife for as little reason as her talking too much. Extended families tended to live together under the authority of the patriarch and the matriarch. The duty of filial piety was paramount. The Zhou patriarch Wen Wang opposed the use of alcohol except in the ceremonies, as the fall of the Shang Dynasty was attributed to excessive drinking. The ruler's ancestral temple was the most important building where diplomatic banquets were held and from which military expeditions began. Thus, religion and the state were combined. The use of writing was so extensive in ancient China that for about 3,000 years, the number of books in Chinese was greater than all the other books in the world. And that's up into the 18th century. Thus, to understand the ethics of Zhou China, we must turn mostly to their literature. By the time of Confucius, in the 6th century BC, there were already 6 classics. 1, I Ching, Book of Changes, the classic of philosophy. 2, Shi Jing, Book of Odes, the classic of poetry. 3, Yi Li, Ceremonial Etiquette, the classic of propriety. 4, Shu Jing, Book of Documents, the classic of history. 5, Chun Chu, Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of Lu. And 6, a classic of music which was lost by the time of the Han Dynasty. These, supplemented by the Zhou Chuan, a commentary on the Spring and Autumn Annals, Sun Tzu's Art of War, Zhang Guozi's Intrigues of the Warring States, and Sima Qian's Shi Qi, will reveal much of the ethics of the ancient Zhou ways. From the 6th to the 3rd centuries, several outstanding philosophers had immense influence in the entire history of Chinese culture. Confucianism will be discussed in the life and works of Confucius, Menzi, and Xunzi. Taoism will be revealed in the works of Lao Tzu, Chuang-Tzu, and Li-Tzu. Mo-Tzu founded his own religion, and the legalism of Han Fei-Tzu greatly influenced the forming of the Qin Empire. The short-lived Qin Dynasty and the first part of the Han Dynasty are extensively portrayed in the writings of the great historian Sima Qian. I Ching, Book of Changes. The legendary creator of what came to be the I Ching is said to be Fu Xi, who is associated with hunting and fishing and the invention of cooking. The 8 trigrams using the dual principles of yang and yin are surely quite ancient. References are also made to early versions in the Shia and Shang Dynasties. But the main authorship of the 64 hexagrams is credited to King Wen, who was supposed to have written the judgments while imprisoned by the last Shang king, and to his son, the Duke of Zhou, who originated the readings for the changing lines. This oracle does seem to have replaced the bones and tortoise shells used by the Shang, and it is surmised that the primitive line combinations are derived from attempts to read the cracks in the oracle bones. Often called the Changes of Zhou, Zhou-Yi, it was primarily a Zhou book. Computers are based on this simple system of constant choices between 2 principles. The yang is represented by a solid line and relates to the male, light, creative, heaven, firm, active, and so on. The yin is shown as a broken line and refers to the female, dark, receptive, earth, yielding, passive, etc. A line obviously has 2 possibilities, a double line 4, a trigram 8, and the doubled trigram or hexagram 64. The process of change is created by a 3-step process of determining each line by adding yin 2s and yang 3s, resulting in a yang 7, a yin 8, a yang 9, or a yin 6. The last 2 being so strongly yang or yin that they will change into their opposites, yielding a new hexagram. The ancient way of consulting the oracle used 50 yarrow sticks, separating them into 2 piles and pulling them out by 4s. Later, for convenience, 3 coins could be tossed 6 times. However, the process with the yarrow sticks contains a bias toward changing yang lines, or 9s, because the first 2 or 3 in each line has a 3 in 4 chance of being a 3. Thus, the chance of getting a changing yang line is 3 times greater than getting a changing yin line. But this is more than balanced toward yin, because 8s are more likely than 7s, and because the 9s change into yin lines, resulting in a second hexagram with more chances for yin lines than for yang. Though changes are more likely to be made by the male principle, in the ancient Chinese way of using the oracle, the eventual results favor the female principle. One of the oldest books in China, the I Ching, was used for centuries and studied by Confucius, who is credited with writing the commentaries, though much of these were probably written by his followers. The Shuo Guo, which discusses the 8 trigrams, is quite ancient, though. It begins, "In ancient times, the holy sages made the Book of Changes thus. They invented the Yarrow stalk oracle in order to lend aid in a mysterious way to the light of the gods. To heaven they assigned the number 3, and to earth the number 2. From these they computed the other numbers. They contemplated the changes in the dark and the light, and established the hexagrams in accordance with them. They brought about movements in the firm and the yielding, and thus produced the individual lines. They put themselves in accord with the way and its power, and in conformity with this laid down the order of what is right. By thinking through the order of the outer world to the end, and by exploring the law of their nature to the deepest core, they arrived at an understanding of fate." The text goes on to say that they determined the way of heaven is dark and light, the way of the earth yielding and firm, and the human way loving and just. The first 2 lines represent the earth, the middle two humans, and the top two heaven. The trigrams correlate with the 8 directions, the seasons, the father, mother, 3 sons and 3 daughters, and so on. Though in Chinese cosmology the 5 elements are fire, earth, water, wood, and metal, the trigrams are based on the 4 elements found in most ancient cultures representing energy, solid, gas, and liquid as fire, earth, air, or wind, and water, along with the 4 related forms of thunder, the mountain, heaven, and the lake. Heaven is creative, earth receptive, thunder arousing, wind gentle, fire clinging or clear, water abysmal or dangerous, the mountain still, and the lake joyous. The first 3 lines represent the inner and the top 3 the outer. Once light and dark have been created, there may be good and bad fortune, remorse and humiliation. But no blame means that one is in a position to correct one's mistakes. Not necessarily fatalistic, the book is designed to offer counsel for different situations so that people may control more wisely their own destinies by understanding circumstances better. Ultimately, one may go back to the beginnings of things and pursue them to their ends, understanding birth and death. The union of seed and power produces everything, but the escape of the soul brings about change. Thus, the conditions of outgoing and returning spirits may be known. By resembling heaven and earth, people do not have to be in conflict with them. Through wisdom, one may bring order to the world, be active and not carried away by fate nor worried. Being content with circumstances, one may be genuine in kindness and so practice love. Consulting the I Ching, one may observe before speaking and discuss before moving, thus perfecting the changes and transformations. Through words and actions, the superior person moves heaven and earth. The Ta Chuan, great treatise, also states that sages fasted in order to make their natures divinely clear. The commentary on the first hexagram, the creative, states that superior people can govern because they embody love, can unite people through propriety because they bring about the harmonious cooperation of all that is beautiful, can bring them harmony through justice because they further all beings, and can carry out all actions because they persevere and are firm. Here the Confucian influence is clearly seen. Also, the superior person learns to gather material and sort it out through questioning in order to become generous and kind. The character of the great is in accord with heaven and earth. The arrogant know how to press forward, but not how to draw back. Know existence, but not annihilation. Only the holy know both without losing their true nature. The commentary on the second hexagram draws on Taoist ideas about the use of the feminine yin, which is the way of the earth, the wife, and the one who serves. One should serve the king as the dark possesses beauty, but veils it, not claiming the completed work, though bringing it about vicariously. When heaven and earth are creating in change and transformation, the capable withdraw into the dark. When the eminent subordinate subordinate themselves to those below, they win the hearts of the people. The sixth line reading of the hexagram Youthful Folly offers the warning not to commit transgressions while punishing. It is better to prevent transgressions so that both those above and below conform to order. The sequence of the cosmology is from heaven and earth to individual things, to the two sexes, to the relationships of husband and wife, then father and son, prince and servant, and superior and inferior based on the rules of propriety. Heaven and earth stimulate each other, and the holy stimulate the hearts of the people so that the world can attain peace. There are other Chinese oracles and cosmologies, but the I Ching is by far the oldest and most influential. Its reflections on various situations represent the beginning of philosophy in China. Shi Jing, Book of Odes. The Book of Odes is the oldest poetry to influence later generations in China. Though some of them may be older, most of the poems are thought to have been composed in the 8th or 7th centuries BC. They are often quoted in the works of Confucius. Many are love songs of courtship and marriage. In one, a young man promises to love her forever. In another, a young woman asks her lover not to break the willows nor climb over the wall, not because she doesn't love him, but because she is afraid of what her parents, brothers, and people will say. Another fears being seduced and abandoned. A third has run away from her family, and the metaphor of rain and a rainbow implies that she is pregnant. The poet doubts that the man will fulfill his promises because he is bent on higher connections. Usually, marriage is arranged by talking with her parents, but without a matchmaker, he cannot get her. The double standard of sex can be found in China, as a woman warns ladies not to take their pleasure with men, though a man taking his pleasure may be condoned. She complains that she suffered 3 years of poverty with him and never neglected her work, but he was the one who altered his ways and was unfaithful. First, he took to finding fault with her, and then he became rough with her. Her brothers have disowned her and laughed at her, but thinking it over calmly, she takes responsibility for bringing it all upon herself. The poems on war include this complaint. Minister of war, we are the king's claws and fangs. Why should you roll us on from misery to misery, giving us no place to stop in or take rest? Minister of war, we are the king's claws and teeth. Why should you roll us from misery to misery, give us no place to come to and to stay? Minister of war, truly you are not wise. Why should you roll us from misery to misery? We have mothers who lack food. Another poem describes how the people are ordered by the king to bring out their carts. The king's services bring them hardships and no time to rest, but they fear the writing on the tablets. Once the enemy's chiefs have been captured and bound as criminals, they can return home again. Many poems celebrate the Zhou revolutionary defeat of the Shang Dynasty and the exploits of King Wen, King Wu, and the Duke of Zhou, who is credited with showing compassion to the people. Many poems express a religious faith that God or the spirits will reward good behavior. Others call forth blessings and ask for increase and abundance for all. Blessings are secured by following the old ways without malice or hate. Inward spiritual power is linked to one's ancestor spirits. The fall of the Shang Dynasty is used as a warning that one should never shame one's ancestors, or one will bring ruin upon oneself. King Wen is offered as an example, who asked, "Why should the violent Shang men be in office and in power? They who support slanders, brigands, and thieves." He declares that resentment is building up against them so that none backs them anymore. The Shang are flushed with wine and disorderly in manners, and they do not follow the old ways. Even if they have no wise men, at least they could follow their own laws. But they do not listen to heaven's great charge. Even the Shang had a mirror in history in the Shia Dynasty, which they had overthrown. In feasting, warnings are given against drinking too much and carousing. When people are drunk, they don't know what blunders they commit. Drinking wine may be fortunate if it is done with decency, but after 3 cups, one no longer knows what one is saying. Aristocrats are asked to set good examples for the common people to follow, but a man without dignity, poise, and manners is better off dead. Dignified manners help power, but nothing is as strong as goodness. One taking counsel widely, far-seeing in plans, timely in announcing them, and using proper decorum becomes a pattern for the people. But a poet complains that today's rulers have brought confusion into government with wild drinking orgies and dissipation. The ruler ought to pay attention to the views of commoners as well as gentlemen, and be cautious in speaking. because it is easier to polish scratched jade than take back a slip of the tongue. One should not be rash in words, because secrets are not often kept. The prince is counseled not to usurp nor go beyond his rights. The wise listen to the ancient sayings and follow the way of inner power, but the fool says he has a right to his own ideas. The poet then speaks to his son, who appears to him heedless of his advice. He is a grandfather and should know. If the son does not take his advice, his people will be reduced to extremities, for heaven is sending calamities and destroying the country. Other poets also lament that the young do not pay attention to their fathers and mothers, nor the disorders of the land. Slanders replace advice and are increasing. Those who speak of caution are considered disloyal. One complains that there is no land that is not the king's, and no one who is not the king's slave. Another poet suggests not escorting the big chariot and thinking about the sorrows of the world, or one will only be loaded with care and despair. A third poem warns against going too close to the king, because the one who reproves him will be slaughtered by him. These poems became a textbook for many generations, and diplomats were expected at least to be aware of their content, if not able to quote them from them to make their points. Li, Propriety. Several books were used at different times as the classic on propriety, ritual, and etiquette. The oldest is the Li, which means ceremonial etiquette. After the burning of the books by the Shang Dynasty in 213 BC, the text was recited from memory by Gao Tong. Other portions of the ancient text were found when the house of Confucius was torn down by Emperor Jing in the middle of the 2nd century BC. The scholar Zheng Kan Zheng in the 2nd century CE combined these two to reconstruct the book. Another similar book on rituals was the Zhou Li, and eventually the Confucian Li Ji became the classic of propriety. The Yi Li gives detailed instructions for formal behavior and manners in regard to the capping of an officer's son, initiation into manhood, marriage of an officer and visits of officers, banquets, archery contests, missions to other states, audience with the king, and extensive instructions for mourning and funeral arrangements. Precedent is considered quite important, and one is often instructed to refuse at first before accepting an honor. One of the 4 directions is often specified, and there is much bowing and descriptions of simple tasks like pouring wine and offering food. When an officer visits another, he is told what to discuss and even where to direct his gaze. In speaking with a prince, one talks of one's official business, with an official of one's service to his prince, with older men of the control of children, with young people of their filial and brotherly duties, with the common man of geniality and goodness, with those in minor offices of loyalty and sincerity. By speaking to an official, one begins by looking him in the face to gauge one's chances of a favorable reception. Towards the middle of an interview, one looks at his breast as an indication of one's trust in him, and also respect, indicating by the lowering of the eyes. And at the end of the interview, one's eyes are again directed to his face to see how he is impressed. The order is never changed and is used in all cases. In the case of a father, the son's eyes are allowed to wander, but not higher than the face, so as not to seem too proud, nor lower than the girdle. If one is not speaking, then when the other is standing, one looks at his feet, and if he sits, at his knees, in sign of humility. The importance placed on so many details of manners meant that tradition and education became essential in order for one to be accepted in this social world. They probably stabilized behavior and made change difficult, though it did allow anyone to rise to a higher social status if one got the proper education. Shu Jing, Book of Documents. The collection of ancient documents that became the classic of history for the Chinese was well known to Confucius, Mencius, and Xunzi. The Shu Jing we have was put together in the early Han Dynasty after the burning of the books, when scholars such as Fu Sheng wrote down in a more modern script what they remembered. Then ancient documents were found in the wall of the Confucius house and elsewhere, and the ancient script was added, though later scholars questioned its authenticity, saying that it was forged from various quotes from ancient authors. Either way, most of it seems to be based on very ancient material. The Shu Jing begins with the Canon of Yao, a sacred writing about the most ancient Chinese ruler. Yao is described as being naturally reverential, intelligent, accomplished, and thoughtful. He governed so well that all the people became brightly intelligent, and even the black-haired people were transformed. Yao was said to have lived for 99 years and ruled for 70 until the middle of the 23rd century BC, when he appointed Shun as his successor, because Shun had overcome bad parents with his filial piety and led them to self-government. The Canon of Shun describes how Shun encouraged men of virtue and talent, listened to the views of all, tried not to oppress the helpless nor neglect the poor, as only a Di could do. Di can mean God or ruler or both. Shun mitigated the cruel punishments of branding, mutilation, castration, and death with fines, exile, and death only for repeated and presumptuous transgressions. Shun is advised by Yi to observe the laws, employ men of worth, use the light of reason, not to go against what is right to win praise from people, nor oppose the people's wishes to follow his own desires. Shun is commended by Gao Yao, his minister of crime, for presiding with generous forbearance, not punishing the errors of criminals nor inadvertent and doubtful crimes. Rather than execute an innocent person, he would rather risk irregularity and error. Near the end of Shun's 30-year rule, he recognized the ability of Yu and declared that heaven had appointed him his successor. All his advisors agreed, and the decision was confirmed by divination. When the people of Miao rebelled, Yi counseled Yu to use virtue, because pride brings loss, but humility increase. Just as Shun had transformed his parents with virtue, Yu drew back his troops and implemented the virtues of peace. After 70 days, the lord of the Miao came to terms. The counsels of Gao Yao for Yu contain a description of the following 9 virtues: affability combined with dignity, mildness combined with firmness, bluntness combined with respectfulness, aptness for government combined with reverent caution, docility combined with boldness, straightforwardness combined with gentleness, and easy negligence combined with discrimination, boldness combined with sincerity, and valor combined with justice. Yu believes that Gao Yao's words may be put into practice and will be crowned with success. Yao had appointed Yu the Earl of Shia, and thus when he began the tradition of hereditary succession, the Shia Dynasty was born and lasted for almost 500 years before it was overthrown by the Shang. The first book on the Shia Dynasty describes the rivers and soil of the various provinces and Yu's labors to regulate the waters and prevent floods. In the second book, the king, probably Yu's son, threatens his soldiers on the verge of a battle that if they do not obey his orders, not only will they be killed, but their children as well. Thus, already the limitations of hereditary rule are seen in comparison with choosing leaders based on ability and virtue. Tai Kang was considered so lifeless because he went out to hunt so much that his 5 brothers complained that he allowed the country to fall into ruin, and so they revolted against him. In the other book on the Shia Dynasty, one of these brothers is attempting to bring order by punishing bad ministers, though he claims he will not punish those who were forced to follow them, as he leads his soldiers into battle. The Shang Dynasty traces its lineage to Shia, who was appointed Minister of Instruction by Shun. 14 generations later, there arose Tong, who became the founding king of the new dynasty. In his speech, Tong declares that the many crimes of the Shia sovereign have caused heaven to turn against him. Jia, the last Shia king, has exhausted the people and oppressed the cities. The people no longer feel bound to serve him. Tong claims to be the one appointed by heaven to punish him. When Tong banished Jia, he felt ashamed and had his minister explain that heaven provides a person of intelligence to govern when the previous ruler is no longer virtuous. The able and right-principled are to be favored. The good have freedom. The weak are absorbed, and the willfully blind punished. Disorderly states going to ruin should be taken over by a virtuous ruler. Order comes from justice and propriety. Those who question and learn grow and come to dominion, but those who think themselves superior and listen to no one come to ruin. Then King Tong himself announces that the Shia tyrant caused suffering and protest. The way of heaven blesses the good and makes the bad miserable. Thus Tong dealt with the Shia ruler as a criminal. Tong was succeeded by his grandson, Tai Jia, who was warned by Yi Yin against the 10 evil ways of constant dancing, drunken singing, extravagance with women, wealth, wandering, hunting, despising wise words, resisting the upright, ignoring the old and virtuous, and keeping the company of impudent youths. Finding the young sovereign disobedient, Yi Yin confines the king in a palace near his father's tomb for the traditional 3 years of mourning, after which the king returns sincerely virtuous. Yi Yin counsels him that people cherish those who are benevolent, and the spirits respond only to sincere sacrifices. An intelligent sovereign is careful whom he follows. Like his grandfather, Tai Jia should cultivate virtues so that he can be a friend of the Supreme God. He must begin low to rise high, and not slight the people's occupations. Be as careful at the end as at the beginning. When hearing distasteful words, he must inquire if they are right. When hearing words that accord with his own views, he must inquire if they are contrary to what is right. Nothing can be attained without careful thought, nor accomplished without diligent effort. The appointment of heaven can change if one is not constant in virtue. The Shia were overthrown because they lost their virtue and oppressed the people. The latter half of the Shang Dynasty is referred to as the Yin Dynasty. The 20th Shang king, Wu Ding, dreamed that God gave him a good assistant who would speak for him. Searching the kingdom with a picture, they found the builder Yue, and Wu Ding instructed Yue how he could help him. Yue warns that the mouth can lead to shame and militarism to war. Before weapons are used, one should examine oneself. Good government, depending on good officers. Officers should not be given to favorites, but to the able and worthy. Careful thought before movement at the proper time is best. But the vanity of thinking one is good can lose the merit one's ability might produce. Shame for a mistake should not be perpetuated into a crime. Too many ceremonies bring disorder. The king thanks Yue, who replies that it is not the knowing that is difficult, but the doing. Finally, the Shang Dynasty deteriorated into drinking and disorder. The Count of Wei declares that the House of Yin can no longer rule, because their mad indulgence in spirits has destroyed their ancient virtue. The people, small and great, have taken to highway robbery, villainy, and treachery. Nobles and officers compete in violating the laws, and criminals are rarely apprehended. The common people rise up and commit violent outrages on one another. Yin is sinking into ruin. Most of the 30 books of Zhou concern the beginnings of the Zhou dynasty. In the Great Declaration, King Wu explains his reasons for taking up arms against the Shang king. The tyrant Zhou is accused of not reverencing heaven, inflicting calamities and atrocities on the people, and abandoning himself to drink, lust, and luxury. Offices are hereditary, and his ministers have become as corrupt as he is and are fighting each other to extermination. Punishments have been extended to the relatives of the offenders. King Wu cites the example of how the first Shang ruler overthrew the corrupt Shia dynasty because King Jia had lost the mandate of heaven. Zhou has treated badly and degraded his best officers. King Wu believes that he has been appointed by heaven to take over the government. because he is backed by virtuous men and the people. The ancients have said that the one who soothes them is their sovereign, while the one who oppresses them is their enemy. King Wu also presents a great plan he claims was given to the ancient Yu, which includes the cosmology of the 5 elements of water, fire, wood, metal, and earth, the 5 personal matters of bodily demeanor, speech, seeing, hearing, and thinking, and the 8 governmental objects of food, wealth, sacrifices, works, instruction, criminal justice, observances for guests, and the army. The sovereign ought to reward virtue and not oppress the friendless and childless, nor fear the distinguished. Let competent ministers cultivate good conduct. Like heaven itself, the sovereign should not show partiality or selfishness. The 3 virtues include strong rule during violence and disorder, mild rule during harmony and order, and correct straightforwardness during peace and tranquility. A story of a metal-bound coffer tells how King Wu was ill and dying, that when he was ill and dying, the Duke of Zhou offered his own life to the spirits in his place, writing his prayer on a document and sealing it in the coffer. King Wu did recover, but the Duke of Zhou lived on also. 5 years later, King Wu died, and some suspected that the Duke of Zhou might try to take the throne. Actually, the Duke of Zhou spent 2 years in the east fighting off rebellions. Wu's son, King Cheng, discovered the coffer and, moved to tears, invited the Duke of Zhou back to the court. Having been allowed to live, many of the Shang nobility rebelled with some of the Zhou king's brothers. After this revolt was put down by the Duke of Zhou, King Cheng invited the Count of Wei to take over the Shang inheritance and rule in Sung, because he had been degraded by the last king and refused to fight on either side out of both virtue and loyalty. In this way, the Shang sacrifices and spiritual tradition were allowed to continue during the Zhou period. The early Zhou kings continually emphasized the importance of ruling by virtue. They followed the penal laws of King Wen and avoided using only terror and violence. One announcement warns against drunkenness, which is blamed for the ruination of the Shang Dynasty. King Wen recommended that spirits only be used on the occasion of sacrifices. Overseers are advised not to give way to violence and oppression, but show reverence for the friendless and find helping connections for women in need. Early in the reign of King Cheng, the Duke of Shao and the Duke of Zhou arranged for the building of a new city in Lo, where many of the defeated Yin people had been removed. They advised the king to be aware that the favor of heaven is not certain, but must be continually earned through the virtue of reverence. If the king avoids excessive violence and capital punishment, the people will imitate his virtue. The Yin people are encouraged to work hard and prosper and cease their disaffection. The Duke of Zhou claims that heaven helped the Zhou and defeated the Yin, because heaven supports the virtuous and punishes wrongdoers. The Duke of Zhou describes this ethical philosophy of history in his advice to King Cheng when he retired from the court. He contrasts the long and successful reigns of the first 3 Shang kings to the short and worse terms of the later Yin rulers. He points to the model of King Wen, who dressed simply, worked in agriculture, and did not hunt excessively, in contrast to the last Yin tyrant who abandoned himself to drunkenness. Although his own brothers had rebelled against him with the Yin, the Duke of Zhou forgave the son of one of these rebels because he showed virtue and merited an office. The 6 ministries of the early Zhou governments were to continue in China for about 3,000 years. The Prime Minister presided over the management of the officers and secured uniformity in the kingdom. The Minister of Instruction was responsible for education in the states, diffusing knowledge of human obligations, and training the military in obedience. The Minister of Religions presided over ceremonies and regulated religious services. The Minister of War oversaw the military forces and the security of the borders. The Minister of Crime enforced the laws by apprehending and punishing wrongdoers. The Minister of Works presided over the land, the 4 classes of people, and the proper seasons for farming. The Duke of Zhou's influence lasted long after his death. Counselors recalled his advice that officers follow a middle course to punish those who are disobedient to government, remembering that the end of punishment is to end punishing. Here is some of his advice. Do not cherish anger against the obstinate and dislike them. Seek not every quality in one individual. You must have patience, and you will be successful. Have forbearance, and your virtue will be great. Mark those who discharge their duties well, and also mark those who do not do so. Advance the good to induce those who may not be so to follow. The people are born good and are changed by things, so that they resist what their superiors command and follow what they love. Do you but reverently observe the statutes, and they will be found in virtue, and they will thus all be changed, and truly advance to a great degree of excellence. In the last book of the Shu Jing, Duke Mu of Qin in 631 BC forgives his three counselors who impetuously advised him to make a treacherous attack on Jin, which failed and resulted in their capture. When they are returned for punishment by the Marquis of Jin, Duke Mu takes responsibility himself for the defeat because he foolishly listened to their youthful counsel rather than his older and wiser advisors. It is easy to see why the Shu Jing became a classic. This book of ancient historical documents was to have a tremendous influence on Chinese politics and philosophy, offering models of ethical behavior to rulers for centuries to come.